A woman humiliated a black soldier on an airplane, thinking she knew everything about people like him. But after landing, the truth was waiting for her, which changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. Catherine adjusted her seatbelt with a sharp tug, sighing as she scanned the crowded plane. She had been traveling all day, and the delays, the bustling crowds, and the endless noise had worn her thin. Now, she just wanted to sit quietly and get through this flight. But as her eyes landed on the person seated next to her, she felt the heat of irritation creeping up her neck. He was a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, dressed in a military uniform that looked freshly pressed. His dark skin stood out against the crisp green fabric of his jacket, and a small name tag on his chest read Williams. He had a large rucksack at his feet, which bulged awkwardly into her legroom. Catherine glanced at him again, narrowing her eyes. He wasn't looking at her, just staring calmly out the window, as if the chaos around him didn't exist. It only made her angrier. She had seen plenty of soldiers before, at airports, on TV, in parades. They always carried themselves with a quiet confidence, as though their mere presence demanded respect, and people gave it to them without question. Catherine, however, couldn't help but feel irritated by the sight of him. What was so special about wearing a uniform? She worked tirelessly, day after day, in her high-stress corporate job, and no one ever stopped to thank her or call her a hero. Soldiers, she thought, received undue praise for simply doing their job, while people like her were overlooked. She shifted in her seat, trying to avoid the man's rucksack, which was taking up far too much space. Finally, she couldn't hold back. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "Could you move that bag? It's in my way." The man turned to her, his face calm and unreadable. He nodded slightly. "Sorry about that," he said quietly, pulling the bag closer to his legs. Catherine felt a brief pang of guilt at his polite response, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of annoyance. "It's fine," she replied curtly, crossing her arms. "I just think people should be considerate of others." The man didn't respond. He simply adjusted his bag and returned his gaze to the window. Catherine felt her irritation bubbling again. He wasn't even looking at her. Did he think he was above engaging with her? "You know," she began, leaning slightly toward him, "you soldiers always think you're so special. Just because you wear a uniform doesn't mean you're any better than the rest of us. We all work hard, you know. You're not the only ones sacrificing something." The man turned his head slowly, his expression still calm, though his jaw tightened slightly. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he said evenly. "I'm just trying to get home." His response caught Catherine off guard. She had expected him to argue back, to defend his position, to play the hero card. Instead, he spoke with a quiet humility that she found unsettling. It only made her more determined to prove her point. "Right," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Trying to get home to what? A parade in your honor? People lining up to thank you for doing a job you chose? Must be nice to get all that praise just for wearing a uniform." The man's eyes flicked toward her briefly, but he said nothing. His silence felt like a challenge, and Catherine couldn't resist pushing further. "I mean, let's be honest," she continued, her voice laced with sarcasm. "You're not out there saving the world. You're not on the front lines risking your life every day. Most of you just sit around in offices or get cushy assignments, and people act like you're heroes. Meanwhile, the rest of us are out here working our asses off without any of the fanfare." The man's hands rested on his lap, his fingers loosely interlaced. He didn't speak, didn't even look at her. Catherine felt her frustration boil over. His refusal to engage was infuriating. It was as if he thought he was above the conversation, above her. "Don't you have anything to say for yourself?" she snapped. "Or are you just going to sit there and pretend you're better than everyone else?" Finally, the man turned to her fully, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time, Catherine noticed a hint of exhaustion in his gaze, a weariness that seemed to run deeper than physical fatigue. "I'm not trying to pretend anything," he said softly. "I'm just trying to get home to my daughter." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unexpected. Catherine blinked, momentarily stunned. She hadn't expected that. She had been ready for an argument, for a defensive speech about patriotism or sacrifice. But this was something else. "Your daughter?" she repeated, her tone skeptical. "Right. And I suppose she's just sitting there waiting for you to come home and save the day. How convenient." The man's face remained steady, but his eyes flickered with something Catherine couldn't quite place. He looked back toward the window, as if the conversation was over. But Catherine wasn't finished. "Look," she said, her voice harsher now, "you can play the family card all you want, but it doesn't change the fact that people like you get way too much credit for what you do. You're not the only one with responsibilities. The rest of us have families too, you know. We make sacrifices every day without expecting applause for it." The man didn't respond. His silence felt like a wall, impenetrable and unyielding. Catherine crossed her arms tightly over her chest, fuming. Why wouldn't he defend himself? Why wouldn't he fight back? It was infuriating. The hum of the plane's engines filled the awkward silence between them. Catherine glanced around and noticed that some of the other passengers were looking in their direction. She felt a flicker of embarrassment, but quickly pushed it aside. She wasn't the one in the wrong here. The man finally spoke again, his voice low and steady. "You're right," he said simply. "You don't know what I've sacrificed, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter." His words cut through Catherine's anger like a knife. She opened her mouth to respond, but found that no words came. She turned away, staring out the window, her mind racing. Something about the way he had spoken, calm, measured, without a trace of bitterness, made her feel uneasy. The rest of the flight passed in tense silence. Catherine avoided looking at the man, but she couldn't stop replaying his words in her head. "I'm just trying to get home to my daughter." What had he meant by that? Was it just an excuse? A way to deflect her criticism? Or was there more to his story than she had assumed? As the plane began its descent, Catherine stole a glance at him. He was still staring out the window, his face calm but distant, as though he were somewhere far away. She noticed his hands resting on his lap, his fingers lightly gripping a photograph that she hadn't seen him take out before. She couldn't make out the details, but it looked like a picture of a little girl. For the first time, Catherine felt a pang of doubt. Had she been wrong about him? The plane's engines hummed steadily as the cabin lights dimmed slightly for the descent. Catherine shifted in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she could physically shield herself from the unease creeping into her thoughts. The man next to her, the soldier, still hadn't said another word. He simply sat there, his posture relaxed but his eyes distant, staring at the darkening sky outside the window. His silence felt louder than any retort could have been, an unspoken rebuke that gnawed at Catherine's confidence. She turned her gaze to her phone, scrolling aimlessly through her emails, though nothing held her attention. Her mind kept circling back to his words. "I'm just trying to get home to my daughter." They lingered like a whisper in the back of her head, refusing to be dismissed. She glanced at him again, almost involuntarily, and noticed his hands resting lightly on his lap. The photograph he had held earlier was now tucked away, but the image of him gripping it, as if it were an anchor, stayed with her. Catherine wasn't sure why, but her irritation had shifted. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something heavier, more unsettling. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had misstepped somehow, though she couldn't pinpoint where or how. He hadn't argued with her, hadn't even raised his voice. And yet, his quiet demeanor, his refusal to engage with her provocations, had left her feeling strangely defensive. She wasn't used to feeling this way. Usually, when she argued with someone, she walked away convinced she had won. But this time there was no victory, only a hollow, uncomfortable silence. As the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, Catherine gripped the armrests instinctively. The cabin jolted, and a few gasps echoed around her. She felt her stomach drop momentarily before the plane stabilized. The soldier next to her didn't react beyond tightening his grip on the armrests. His face remained calm, though his knuckles whitened slightly. Catherine caught herself staring at him, trying to read his expression. He didn't look afraid, but there was a tension in his body that she hadn't noticed before. It made her wonder what else he was holding back. The turbulence subsided, and the cabin settled into its previous quiet. Catherine released the armrests and tried to refocus her attention on her phone, but the words on the screen blurred together. Her thoughts drifted again, this time to her own life. She wasn't sure why, but something about the soldier had triggered a flood of memories she usually kept buried. She thought about her career, how hard she had worked to climb the corporate ladder. She had sacrificed weekends, holidays, and relationships to get where she was. And yet, despite everything she had achieved, she often felt invisible, unappreciated. It was as though the world had decided that people like her, ordinary, hard-working, but unremarkable, didn't matter. That was why she resented soldiers like him. They wore a uniform and were instantly seen as heroes, while she had to fight for every scrap of recognition. But as soon as the thought formed, it felt hollow. She glanced at the man again, studying his profile. He didn't look like someone basking in adoration or expecting praise. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that came from a long day of work, but something deeper, more enduring. It reminded her of the exhaustion she had seen in her father's eyes when he came home from the factory late at night, too worn out to speak. The plane began its final descent, and the announcement to prepare for landing crackled through the cabin. Catherine adjusted her seatbelt and straightened in her seat, relieved that the flight was almost over. She told herself that once they landed, she could put this uncomfortable encounter behind her. But as she looked out the window at the city lights below, she felt a twinge of regret. She didn't want to admit it, but part of her wished she had handled the situation differently. When the plane touched down, Catherine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The cabin, filled with the familiar rustling of passengers gathering their belongings and the overhead bins creaking open. Catherine stayed seated, watching as people shuffled past her, their faces tired but relieved to have arrived. The soldier next to her didn't move immediately. He waited patiently, his hands resting on his knees, as if he were in no rush to leave. Catherine hesitated. She wanted to say something, to break the silence that had stretched between them since their argument. But the words wouldn't come. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say. An apology? A question? Instead, she looked away, pretending to focus on the bag she was pulling from under the seat. As the line of passengers began to thin, the soldier finally stood, grabbing his rucksack and slinging it over his shoulder. Catherine couldn't help but notice how carefully he moved, as if he were trying not to draw attention to himself. He nodded politely to her before stepping into the aisle, his expression unreadable. She watched him go, a strange emptiness settling in her chest. When Catherine stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she spotted him again. He was standing near the baggage claim, and for the first time she saw someone waiting for him. An older woman stood there, her hands clutching a photograph tightly to her chest. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she hurried forward, wrapping him in a tight embrace. Catherine couldn't hear their conversation, but the emotion on the woman's face was unmistakable. Relief, gratitude, and pride. Catherine froze, her suitcase forgotten beside her. She watched as the woman showed him the photograph, her fingers tracing the edges as she spoke. The soldier listened quietly, his head bowed slightly, his posture humble. Catherine felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know what their story was, but it was clear that this moment meant everything to them. As she turned to leave, she noticed a television screen in the corner of the terminal. A news report was playing, the sound muted, but the headline caught her eye. Soldier honored for heroic act overseas. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the face on the screen. It was him. The report showed images of him in uniform, standing with his unit, and a brief clip of an interview where he spoke about the sacrifices of his team. The footage cut to a scene of a battlefield, the chaos and destruction stark against the calm voice of the reporter. Catherine's legs felt heavy as she approached the screen, her eyes glued to the images. The report detailed how he had risked his life to save several of his comrades during an ambush, pulling them to safety despite being injured himself. One of the men he saved was the son of the woman she had just seen embrace him. The lump in her throat grew, and she blinked rapidly to fight back tears. She thought about everything she had said to him on the plane, every harsh word and baseless accusation. She had judged him without knowing anything about him, without even trying to understand. And now, faced with the truth of his actions, she felt an overwhelming wave of shame. Catherine turned away from the screen, her chest tight. She didn't know what to do, how to reconcile the person she had been on that plane with the person she wanted to be now. As she walked toward the exit, the weight of her words pressed heavily on her shoulders. She knew she couldn't undo what she had said, but she also knew she couldn't ignore the lesson she had just learned. The soldier's story had opened a crack in the wall of her assumptions, and for the first time in a long time, Catherine felt a glimmer of something she hadn't expected, the desire to change. The terminal's hum surrounded Catherine like a dull roar, but she felt isolated, her thoughts too loud to hear anything else. Her suitcase rolled lightly behind her as she moved through the bustling crowd, her gaze lingering on the soldier and the older woman. The warmth in their embrace and the quiet gratitude in the woman's expression had planted an uncomfortable knot in Catherine's chest. The fleeting glance at the television screen, those images of his heroism, the story of his sacrifice, played on a loop in her mind. She couldn't unsee it. She found herself walking slower, as though her legs weren't entirely her own. Her initial plan to exit the airport quickly, to bury the awkward flight in the back of her mind, had been completely derailed. Something compelled her to look back. The soldier, whose calm demeanor had so infuriated her just hours ago, now stood like a statue of quiet humility, his presence commanding without trying. The woman with him was speaking animatedly, her hands gesturing as if reliving a memory too vivid to contain. He listened attentively, nodding at her words, his posture straight but somehow soft, as though carrying both pride and pain. Catherine slowed to a stop near a row of seats, pretending to adjust her scarf while stealing another glance. She felt a pang of guilt, realizing she was eavesdropping in her own way, but she couldn't tear herself away. The way the older woman touched the photograph, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced its edges, sent a shiver through Catherine. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know its weight. Her eyes darted back to the television screen near the baggage carousel. The report had looped, showing the soldier's photograph again, this time zooming in on his face. The reporter's voice, still muted, added captions to his heroism. Risked his life to pull 3 comrades to safety during an ambush, despite being critically injured himself. The image changed, showing a shaky video from what appeared to be the aftermath of a firefight. Catherine's stomach turned at the sight, smoke rising in the background, men shouting orders, and the blurred figure of someone being carried to safety. The screen cut to an image of a folded American flag draped over a coffin, and Catherine froze. It wasn't just about him, she realized. It was about loss so profound it was impossible to understand unless you'd been through it. And yet, she had dared to diminish it, to scoff at his uniform, to insult his service. Her cheeks burned with shame as she walked toward the airport's exit. The cold air outside hit her like a slap, clearing her mind but leaving her no relief. The scene in the terminal, the news report, and the conversation she'd had with him on the plane, all tangled together in her thoughts. Every word she'd said to him felt heavier now, their weight crushing her chest. She called for a cab and climbed into the back seat, her suitcase sliding onto the seat beside her. As the car pulled away from the curb, Catherine glanced out the window, catching one last glimpse of the soldier and the woman. They were walking toward the exit, the soldier carrying her small bag along with his own rucksack, their steps unhurried. Catherine looked away, the lump in her throat making it hard to breathe. The ride home was silent except for the occasional murmur of the cab driver's radio. Catherine leaned her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass. The city lights blurred into streaks as they sped by, but her mind was still firmly planted in the terminal. She thought about the soldier's daughter, the one he had mentioned with such quiet resolve. What kind of father was he, she wondered. What sacrifices had he made to get back to her? And what kind of person had she been, sitting there judging him, throwing barbed words at a man she didn't know? By the time the cab pulled up in front of her apartment building, Catherine felt drained, though not in the usual way. This wasn't the fatigue of a long flight or a busy day. This was deeper, like a part of her was unraveling. She paid the driver and trudged up the steps to her apartment, the wheels of her suitcase clicking on the pavement. Inside, she set her bag down and sank onto the couch, letting out a long sigh. The silence of her apartment felt oppressive, pressing against her as she replayed the events of the day. She reached for the remote and turned on the TV, hoping to drown out her thoughts with background noise, but the first channel she landed on was airing the same news report she'd seen at the airport. She froze, her hand tightening on the remote. The screen showed the soldier again, this time in an interview. His voice was calm, steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion in his words that made Catherine's chest tighten. "We all make sacrifices," he said, his gaze direct but soft. "It's not just about what we do on the battlefield. It's about the people we leave behind. My daughter. She's the reason I keep going. She's my hero." The camera cut to a picture of a little girl, her hair tied in pigtails, holding a teddy bear almost as big as she was. The caption read, "Sophie Williams, daughter of Sergeant Daniel Williams, battling leukemia." Catherine felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at the screen, the image of the girl blurring as tears welled up in her eyes. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the man she had so harshly judged with the man on the screen. A father, a hero, a human being carrying burdens she couldn't begin to fathom. She turned off the TV and sat in silence, her hands trembling in her lap. For the first time in a long time, Catherine felt truly ashamed. Not the fleeting embarrassment of a misstep at work or a careless remark in a conversation, but a deep, gnawing shame that came from realizing how wrong she had been. She had let her bitterness, her frustrations with her own life, cloud her judgment. She had looked at a man who had given so much and seen only what she wanted to see. The next morning, Catherine woke with a heaviness in her chest that hadn't lifted overnight. She went about her routine mechanically, making coffee and scrolling through her emails, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the soldier and his daughter, about the woman who had hugged him in the terminal, about the sacrifices he had made that she had dismissed so casually. By mid-morning, she couldn't take it anymore. She opened her laptop and began researching. She found the news article from the airport report and read it in full, her eyes lingering on every detail about his service and his family. Then she found a link to a fundraiser for Sophie's treatment. Without hesitation, she clicked on the donation button and contributed more than she normally would have considered reasonable. But it didn't feel like enough. Catherine stared at the confirmation screen, her heart heavy. She didn't want to just donate money. She wanted to make things right. She wanted him to know that she understood now, that she regretted everything she had said to him. But how could she reach him? How could she apologize for the damage she had done? Scrolling further, she found an email address for the charity supporting Sophie's treatment. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, taking a deep breath, she began to type. "Dear Sergeant Williams," she wrote, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know if you'll remember me, but we sat next to each other on a flight yesterday. I need to apologize for the way I spoke to you. I said things that were unfair, unkind, and completely unwarranted. I didn't know your story, and I judged you without reason. I see now how wrong I was, and I'm deeply sorry." She paused, her throat tightening. It was harder than she had expected to put her feelings into words, but she pressed on. "I've read about what you've done, about your bravery and your sacrifices, and I am in awe. I wish I had taken the time to listen instead of assuming the worst. Your daughter, Sophie, is lucky to have a father like you. Please know that I am supporting her fundraiser and will do whatever I can to help. Thank you for everything you've done, for your family, for your comrades, and for people like me who didn't appreciate it before. I hope you can forgive me." Catherine hit send before she could second-guess herself. As the email disappeared from her screen, she leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. She didn't know if he would ever read it, let alone respond. But for the first time since the flight, she felt a small measure of relief. She couldn't undo her words, but maybe, just maybe, she could start to make amends. The next few days were a blur for Catherine. Though she returned to her usual routine, conference calls, spreadsheets, and coffee breaks, her thoughts kept drifting back to the soldier, Sergeant Williams. She found herself checking her email obsessively, hoping for a reply to the message she had sent. But as the days passed with no response, she began to wonder if he had even seen it. She couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. It wasn't just guilt. It was the realization that she had been living her life in a way that didn't align with the person she wanted to be. Her encounter with Sergeant Williams had cracked open something inside her, a part of herself she had long ignored. She had spent so much time building walls against vulnerability, against connection, against anything that might disrupt her carefully controlled world. But now, those walls felt flimsy, brittle, as though they could crumble at any moment. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Catherine sat on her couch scrolling through her phone. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to fill the silence of her apartment. But her scrolling paused when she came across a new article about the fundraiser for Sophie Williams. The headline read, "Local Hero's Daughter Inspires Community Support." The article described how Sergeant Williams had not only raised money for his daughter's treatment, but had also inspired others to contribute to the hospital where Sophie was being cared for. There were quotes from families who had benefited from his efforts, as well as testimonials from his fellow soldiers about his bravery and selflessness. The words painted a picture of a man who was not just a soldier, but a father, a friend, and a source of hope for many. Catherine's eyes welled with tears as she read. She thought about her own life, how she had spent so much time chasing professional success, yet never felt the sense of fulfillment that seemed to radiate from the people in the article. It wasn't that she regretted her achievements, but she couldn't help but feel that something important was missing. She wanted to be part of something bigger than herself, to contribute to the world in a way that mattered. That night, she made a decision. She didn't just want to donate money to Sophie's fundraiser, she wanted to get involved. She began researching ways to support the hospital, looking for volunteer opportunities and upcoming events. She discovered that the hospital was hosting a fundraiser gala in a few weeks to raise awareness for children with chronic illnesses. Without hesitation, she signed up to volunteer. Over the next few weeks, Catherine threw herself into the work. She attended planning meetings, helped coordinate donations, and reached out to local businesses for sponsorships. At first, she felt out of place among the other volunteers, many of whom were parents or medical professionals. But as she got to know them, she realized how much they had in common. They were all there for the same reason, to make a difference. As the gala approached, Catherine felt a growing sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, she was doing something that wasn't about her career or her own success. It was about helping others, about giving back, and it felt good. She found herself thinking less about her mistakes and more about how to move forward, how to be the kind of person she could be proud of. One evening, as she was finalizing details for the event, Catherine received an email notification on her phone. The subject line read, "Thank you for your message." Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. The email was from Sergeant Williams. "Dear Catherine," it began, "thank you for your message. I have to admit I was surprised to hear from you, but I truly appreciate your honesty and your willingness to reach out. It's not always easy to admit when we've been wrong, and I respect the courage it took for you to do so." Catherine felt a lump form in her throat as she continued reading. "I want you to know that I hold no resentment for what happened on the flight. We all have moments where we let our frustrations get the better of us, and I've certainly had my share. What matters is that you took the time to reflect and to make things right. That means more than you know. Sophie is doing better thanks to the incredible support we've received from people like you. Her treatment is ongoing, but we're hopeful for the future. Knowing that there are people out there who care, not just about her, but about all the kids at the hospital, gives us strength. Thank you for your kindness and for your support. It makes a difference, more than words can say. Best wishes, Sergeant Daniel Williams. Catherine stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. His words were so gracious, so forgiving, that they made her chest ache. She hadn't expected such kindness, especially after the way she had treated him. But his response only strengthened her resolve to do more, to be better. The night of the gala arrived, and Catherine stood near the entrance, helping to greet guests as they arrived. The room was beautifully decorated, with twinkling lights and tables adorned with elegant centerpieces. There was an air of celebration, but also of purpose. A shared determination to support the children and families who needed it most. As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself scanning the room, wondering if Sergeant Williams might be there. She hadn't heard anything about him attending, but part of her hoped she might get the chance to thank him in person. She knew it was unlikely. He probably had more important things to focus on, but the thought lingered in the back of her mind. Toward the end of the night, as the event was winding down, Catherine spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Her breath caught as she saw Sergeant Williams standing near one of the tables, talking to a small group of people. He was dressed in a simple suit, his posture as straight and steady as ever. Beside him was a little girl with pigtails clutching a teddy bear. Catherine's heart swelled as she realized it was Sophie. Summoning her courage, Catherine approached them slowly. Sergeant Williams noticed her and smiled warmly, nodding in acknowledgement. "Catherine," he said, his voice as calm and steady as she remembered. "It's good to see you." She returned his smile, though her nerves made it feel shaky. "I wasn't sure if you'd be here," she admitted, "but I'm glad you are. I wanted to thank you for your kindness, for your forgiveness, and for inspiring me to do better." Sergeant Williams nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all have the capacity to grow," he said. "The important thing is that we try." Catherine turned her gaze to Sophie, who was looking up at her with curious eyes. "And this must be Sophie," she said, her voice softening. "Hi, Sophie. I've heard so much about you." Sophie smiled shyly, hugging her teddy bear tighter. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The three of them stood together for a moment, the noise of the gala fading into the background. Catherine felt a sense of peace wash over her, a feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the night came to a close, Catherine watched Sergeant Williams and Sophie leave, their hands clasped as they walked out into the night. She knew she would never forget this moment, this journey. It had started with a mistake, a moment of anger and judgment, but it had led her to something much greater, a chance to change, to make amends, and to be part of something meaningful. For the first time in a long time, Catherine felt truly at peace, and she knew that this was only the beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking tales. Explore our other videos for stories that inspire and challenge perspectives. And if this one resonated with you, share it with someone who might appreciate its message. See you in the next video.